Good afternoon. Welcome to the Elliott School for those of you who are from the outside. We're here to launch what is already a bestseller. So it's already been launched and bought up, apparently. Copies sold out at the American Political Science Association. And I was just told the second most popular book in the series, Cambridge Element. We're here to launch this book on varieties of nationalism. My name is Nathan Brown. It's something you will can quickly forget because I'm basically here just to open things. We've got two of the authors, the two authors of the book, Harris Mylonas and Maya Tudor here, who are going to present their book. And we've got two discussants, Kristine Berzina and Tom Carothers. So I will just lead things off very briefly, turn it over to the authors, then turn it over to the discussants, and then open up the floor for discussion. The Elliott School, in its incredible efficiency, has printed out bios. So if you want to know who we are, I'm not going to go through and read these. They should be well known to you, but if they're not, you can take a peek at the bios on the sheet. Just a few remarks about the topic. I mean, I was there for a workshop with a draft manuscript. I think that was a couple years ago. So I'm familiar with the project. I still don't have my copy, but
it's in the mail.
All right. But I mean, the subject is obviously important, right? Nationalism. It's an incredibly powerful political force. In a sense, I think there are plenty of people here, including myself, who would not be here today were it not for some of the tumultuous political developments surrounding nationalism. For political scientists, it's an extremely attractive thing to study, therefore, because it is so important. Political scientists really like to talk about cause and effect, and explaining where nationalism comes from and explaining what effects it has would seem to be natural things for political scientists to do. But they turn out to be incredibly hard. I know when I've tried to teach nationalism or insert it in a course, it's just hard, and it's hard for a few reasons. First, nationalism, it's a very general term, but each nation or each nationalism is particularistic. It's particular. So you're trying to make general statements about all kinds of ideas and approaches that claim here is how we are distinctive. That's one thing. And the second thing is nationalism rarely appears in unadulterated form, right? It's always attached to something else or opposed to something else. Liberal nationalism, it's talking in the United States about Christian nationalism, and there are even plenty of people who would say, wait a second, you can't have a religious nationalism. Those are alternative forms of identity, but they do combine in some places and they're opposed in others. So it's sort of difficult to untangle. And there's a normative aspect as well. I mean, political scientists are used to dealing with normative concepts. Democracy, usually studied by people who think it's good, or justice, or that sort of thing. Nationalism is hard, not just because it's normative, but because it's good and bad, depending on the variety, or depending on the person. It's responsible for great destruction, for all kinds of liberation and self-realization and so on. And there's all kinds of people who've written about good forms of nationalism and bad forms of nationalism. So it's very impressive that they've written not simply a book, but an elements book. And the elements books are distinctive because they're supposed to be short introductions to the topic. So here's this impossible topics, which they help us think about in a little over 60 pages. And that's what I think. I mean, I don't want to steal the thunder from the discussants. The contribution is to help us think clearly about this, not necessarily to answer questions definitively. Is nationalism good or bad? How does nationalism relate to this or that? But to help us ask the right questions. And again, it's something to sort of help us think clearly. Ask, as I say, the clarifying questions about the nature of nationalism, where it comes from, how it operates, and even think through some of the normative questions as well. So that's my impression of the book. Let me turn it over now to Harris and Maya, who can present the book, and then we'll hear from Kristine and Tom about their reactions to it. And as I say, open it up.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you all for coming, and most importantly for you reading it and commenting on it, Tom and Kristine. I'm going to start, and then Maya will add to some of my comments. I won't speak for too long because we have a lot of people and we want to have a conversation as well. So I think Nathan did a great job presenting the book, actually. So I'm just going to add to it to an extent. we saw a need, and initially Maya and I, when Maya approached me, we wrote an annual review piece for an annual review of political science, a piece for them that was more of synthetic literature review. And then we decided that more is needed and more can be said. And this is the outcome of that more part. But mainly the motivation, and it's not just because nationalism is important, which it is, and just think about the fact that, depending on your count, there are at least 5,000 ethnic groups in the world, and there are about an odd of 190 something recognized nation states. Imagine if every ethnic group sought self-determination. Do the math and you'll see how the world would look like if that was the case, right? So just from those two numbers, you can see how, the potential of this concept and the potential of this type of process. But at the same time, while it's a very important topic at the individual and at the international affairs level, we realized that political scientists were often talking past each other. They were holding different parts of the proverbial elephant that we know from the Buddhist text very well, that story of the blindfolded or blind men, actually, who are holding different parts of the elephant, and they all think it's a different thing that they're holding. So similarly, we felt people who are doing survey research, let's say on national identity salience or patriotism versus nationalism in the US context, had nothing in common or had no dialogue with people who were studying the formation of nation states or secessionist movements and so on and so forth. So we decided to create a framework that brings these things together. Not in a Procrustean way, not in a way that everything needs to fit our framework, but by opening up 3 questions we think are different parts or different ways that nationalism can be approached. The first question being, does a nation exist? The second one being, what type of national narrative does this nation have once it exists? And the third one, when does this national narrative or national identity matter? And from these 3 questions, we generate 5 dimensions. For the first question, doesn't national community exist? We say, well, a lot of it depends on elite and popular fragmentation. Those 2 dimensions are key, are not the only ones, but they're key. For the second question about national narratives, we switch gears from ethnic civic divides, and we talk about a continuum of ascriptiveness, which is not new, but the way we presented it, we think is helpful. And a concept or a dimension we call thickness, and you can think of that as how many layers does an identity kind of come with, a national identity. And then the third question, does it matter? It has to do with what we highlight, the dimension of salience. There are other ways as well. So 3 questions, 5 dimensions, make up the elephant we call nationalism, so to speak. Again, it's an attempt to bring more dialogue in the field and some more concrete things that we had in mind while we were writing the book. I think Maya can highlight those. Yeah.
Right. So again, thank you for having us and for coming. I just want to say talk about 4 reasons why we thought this book was necessary and 4 kind of analytical moves that we take in the book. The first move is, and I think Nathan has already alluded to this, is that nationalism is a different concept than, let's say, war or welfare, in that political scientists own those concepts, right? That's what we study. And if you look across the academia as a policymaker or as an interested academic and say, who do I talk to about the causes and consequences of war? You're going to talk to political scientists. The same is not true of nationalism. There are sociologists, there are historians, there are psychologists, and actually they often don't talk the same language. Even within political science across regions, they don't talk the same language. And that's problem number 1 that we were really trying to solve. We have a part of the book where we talk about how the different disciplines in academia approach the study of nationalism and why we think it's therefore necessary to have this kind of integrative approach. The second, and perhaps because Harris and I are both individuals with European roots to some degree, is that we there is a strong Eurocentrism to the study of nationalism. Those of you in the room who've studied nationalism as an academic, taken a class on it, you will no doubt have spent some time on, the Warwick debates. Where does nationalism come from? Europe and the, German versus French nationalism. And all of those are important debates, but I think that they really are eclipsed by nationalism, the forms of nationalism that we are seeing sprouting in different parts of the world. And we need to take those very, very seriously. So the second problem we were solving was really addressing what we saw as a very strong Eurocentrism in the literature. The third was delinking this idea of ethnicity from nationalism. If you look into the term ethnic nationalism, it's actually not clear what that is. You might, people carry around, I have sort of a general idea, but when you ask people to define it, actually, even the academics who are working with that concept come up with really different ideas of what ethnicity means. So for example, if you study South Asia, like I do, is religion ethnic? Some scholars say yes. Yes. So that's, we say, look, let's delink ethnicity from nationalism and ask empirically, how ethnic is it? How fixed, how rooted in fixed social identities is a nationalism? And finally, and I think perhaps most important, our motivation here was, and it was something that we wrote during the pandemic, was to think about the consequences of nationalism. Most of the academic literature talks about where nationalism comes from. And we, and I, both of us have affiliations in policy schools, really want to think about how nationalism matters. And I think there's no more salient example of that. I'm thinking about Russian and Ukrainian nationalism today. I came into DC a couple of days ago, you see Ukrainian flags around on buildings. So there's a celebration of Ukrainian nationalism at the same time as it's Russia's celebration of its own nationalism as defined by Putin that's responsible for the rise in Ukrainian nationalism, right? So unpacking some of these consequences is really, really important. And we can only do it if we have a clear sense of what the concept is. And that's why we wrote the book.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me turn now to Kristine.
So much. So I'm Kristine Berzina. I'm a managing director at the German Marshall Fund, and I focus on Northern Europe and the United States. But so the accusations of Eurocentrism, I am absolutely guilty of, both in my origins. Originally, I'm from Latvia, and also in my academic and professional track. So I really appreciated in the book the pointing out some of the limitations in the traditional hotspots that are looked at. But of course, there are many other places, and I think it's important to look at those. I, however, am not an expert in those, and so that's not going to be my contribution today. What is useful, I think, when grappling the concept of nationalism is this, almost why is nationalism as a term necessary if it is both everything and nothing, right? If it is so many things to so many people, why do we use it? And do we actually avoid using it? When we look at complicated issues on the world stage, and because I'm a think tanker and very adjacent to policymakers, are there conversations about nationalism currently in the way we think about Ukraine or Russia or other political developments in Europe right now? And I'd say they're not front and center because, again, the squishiness of this concept and its very deep emotional weight is a problem, because it is not just that there are different views on what nationalism is or the adjectives that are attached to it to make it mean something for somebody, but also that the things that it means for people are incredibly big, strong, emotionally resonant things on opposite sides. So again, it's not just gradations of what it could be, but often nationalism can be both liberation, freedom, and in a post-colonial or post-Soviet perspective. But the book also talks about other elements that are shared within the nationalist identity or nationalist concept. So, what is the notion of shared solidarity or sovereignty, community, many things that are incredibly important to society. So these are the positive connotations that are in there. But equally, there are the extremely negative connotations about nationalism and what nationalism could result in, be responsible for, the risks around it. And here there is an undercurrent of oppression, xenophobia, exclusion, harking back to a range of wars, and tremendous loss. And so nationalism feels a scary term to use because you don't know whether the person on the other side is going to see it as a source of positive or intensely negative emotion. And by the time you resolve that, your time for a conversation is over. So how can we talk about nationalism in a way that it is useful, and how can we understand it because it exists and it is a thing? And I think that is the starting point, right? So why does nationalism or nations, do they exist? How do they exist? Do we need to grapple with them? And so you go into your definition. You guys didn't say your definition. I feel like the whole point of this book is definitions, but like this thing has died. Can someone have page 23? I mean, like you guys didn't read it out, but I think it's useful to actually read your definition of
we have two definitions. One is of the nation and the other is of nationalism. And they're summarizing what Maya was talking about. The definition of a nation, we say it's a type of social identity, very vague, meaning we're not saying ethnic or non-ethnic. We don't go into what type of social identity, but it has to be a social identity that aspires to some degree of political self-rule over a distinct territory. And we can talk about why we say to some degree and not aspires to self-rule. Think of UK and containing 4 nations, for example, may not aspire to full self-determination, but some of them may, and so on and so forth. And then nationalism, which is the page 23, we say nationalism or the celebration of the nation entails the intersubjective recognition of an imagined community of people as a locus of loyalty and solidarity, the desire for some degree of self-rule over a distinct territory, and the repertoire of symbols and practices that embody and celebrate that imagined community, ranging from monuments and museums to festivals and holidays.
So there's a lot to unpack and to grapple with there. And I think in the language that the nationalism definition has of an imagined community, I think that in the quick-paced policy world, imagined could therefore mean unimportant or insubstantial or something to be written off, right? What does it mean to be imaginary? And I think that a pressure point between the policy universe and the academic one is to be able to take the time and understand that just because something is imagined or constructed doesn't mean it doesn't exist and doesn't have implications, right? And I think that again, nationalism is hard. The notion of an imagined community is very difficult to grapple with and the implications of it. But just because something is imagined in this definition does not mean it is not real. But and that's tough, right? That is a very tough piece to unpack. So but what I'm curious about is, looking at the ascriptive pieces of this book is how these and the questions of thickness also, or thinness of nationalism are the questions about how they're relevant for our societies today. So the questions I think that they're leading to is, can you become a member of a nation? Can a nation change? How does it evolve? And how does it evolve smoothly? Because here we're in a policy school. And so again, the implications of nationalism matter a lot. What is the mutability? If there are many more aspects, if there is a thicker identity, does that make it more or less able to evolve over time? What are the kind of nationalisms that are more likely to result in a greater conflict? And what are the external pressures that are going to create the potential for conflict as well? And I think we need to use nationalism as a concept to be more anticipatory of the things that we might face. And I think that some of these criteria that have been laid out could be very useful in a practical and applicable way. So in this question, and I think in the question also of in the nationalism definition and the definition of nations, there's the identity question, the imagined community or social identity that can have either civic values or religious or ethnic ones or components. But then there's this self-rule or territorial piece. And so again, why do we talk about nationalism? Why should we be looking at this book? Why should we be using these tools to try to understand the world around us? I think you look at the world today, and you can understand why the frictions over identity, over a community or social identity, and the frictions over territory are incredibly important. In some of the major conflicts or things that are worrying people right now, you have the social identity question, a community question, and a sovereignty question, and both. Again, Middle East is not my scene, but that is your next speaker. But in the Middle East, absolutely, we have a territorial question when it comes to Gaza and Israel. But if we look at Europe, again, more my bread and butter, when we look at a question of social identity and we look at such question of community, we can look within nations as well, or what we understood contemporarily as a nation. And we look at the German elections that are regional elections over the past month or so, and we look at a deep fragmentation between formerly East Germany and West Germany. What is the social identity at play? There is for those who don't follow, there's been a rise in far right and far left political allegiance in the former East of Germany. This does not match sentiments in other parts of the country. Is the question of German national identity in some ways is evolving. And so then it goes back to those questions of how does it evolve? Is it how flexible, agile, inclusive? How does it evolve in different places at different rates? So these are really, really important questions. So we don't really think about contemporary German national identity as being, a subject of great geopolitical concern, but I think it is because it's going to depend a whole lot on what are the policies that Germany makes on the world stage, the European Union, how transatlantic relations are going to go. This is going to be very formative, and it has a lot to do with this question of social identity and what is civic value and what is linguistic or ethnic identity. And of course, in Ukraine, there's exactly the butting up of a territorial question with a social identity and community issue. And so this is such a point of conflagration, of deep passions and limited resources of land that we are seeing literally come to a head right now. And so again, what is the evolution of identity, the flexibility of it, with the inflexibility of the finite amount of land we have on this planet, I think is really a challenge here. But I think it would be helpful in the future to look more at the tools that the definitions and characteristics of nationalism that Harris and Maya have presented here. We should look at those characteristics to try to understand a little bit more about the conflicts we're currently seeing. And for those who are looking further up ahead and concerned about how the world might evolve in the presence of factors that increase salience, right? And that could be industrial transformations, technological questions, territorial problems, the loss of territory, climate change. There will be many other sources of salience that are coming our way. Knowing that we cannot necessarily stop all sources of salience, how can we understand the effect that they can have in different places? And again, nationalism isn't as squishy as some people like to think. It is not scary to think about, and we should really engage with it. So thank you for the book, and thank you for providing us some tools to think about these things more deeply.
Thanks very much. I'm Tom Carothers. I'm a democracy researcher at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace here in Washington. My pleasure to be here. I'd like to congratulate Harris and Maya on a really fine book. It's excellent. So any hopes you might have that I'm going to really tear into them, you're going to have to be disappointed. This book is a really fine example of a systematic demuddling exercise. These are authors who are intent on demuddling a concept which was clearly eating at them and they felt it needed some serious demuddling. And I appreciate that. You know, I looked on Amazon for demuddling devices to see if they're available for purchase, but they're not. But this book is an example of the application of a demuddling spirit. They compare that to the question of definitions of democracy, and they argue that democracy is better defined than nationalism, and I'd agree with you. I think the democracy field, we do sometimes in the community that I work in, lapse into, my view, not very helpful discussions about definitions of democracy that have already been well exercised, but the field is actually fairly well elaborated in terms of definitions, where you're dealing here with a concept which, as you said, Kristine, if I said to you, there's a person out there who's going to come in, he or she is a nationalist. They're going to walk in the room. You would have emotions about that. A nationalist is coming to join our meeting. Whereas if I said a Democrat is joining, probably wouldn't be so scary. Nationalism is a complex concept. And I felt that you provided the kind of right level of systematization. I found the 5-part framework very persuasive. And I do like to pick holes in things, but I couldn't pick any holes in it. I found it was sweeping, but incisive at the same time. And it's academic enough to be rigorous, but not too academic to be incomprehensible. I did trip over Nathan's used to this, we used to work together. I did trip over the word intersubjective. I had to look it up. And after I looked it up and thought I grasped what it was, I said to my wife, you may not realize it, but we have an intersubjective relationship. And she said, I thought we had a pretty conventional marriage. So she had to go to the dictionary too. So you may find yourself occasionally in the book having to resort to the dictionary, but not too much. Now, I breathed a sigh of relief as I was reading the book over 3 of the main points, which they've made here, but I'll just reiterate them because they're very important. One is the delinking of ethnic nationalism from nationalism, or ethnicity as a necessary element of nationalism. I breathed a sigh of relief because in my experience, it's a tremendous oversimplification that you see, particularly in studies of Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. So I was grateful that you took that on head on. Secondly, also a sigh of relief over good versus bad, because, the lack of nationalism in many places is causing a lot of problems. Places like Libya and Yemen and others have struggled a lot with national identity and the lack of it, or conflicts within it, and not just them, but many, many others. And so we really need to change our thinking on that score as well. And then also the moving away from a Eurocentric perspective. Although I would say there was a wave of non-Eurocentric studies of nationalism in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as part of the decolonization period. I was a student of Ernest Gellner when I was at the LSE, and he was a great student of nationalism in the developing world context. And so there was a wave, but then it kind of died out after the end of decolonization. So I think what you're seeing is a bit of a U-shaped something or other on this. But you're certainly right, in the last 20 or 30 years, discussions, at least in the circles that I'm in, about nationalism are often rather Eurocentric. Now, a couple of comments. One thing that I didn't see developed in the book, since I like the framework, I'm not going to sort of try to question it, but one thing that I didn't see developed I think is interesting and important, maybe it's my democracy perspective, is that at least in a number of democracies, what you have, and this relates to something very important that Kristine said in her useful comments about can nationalism evolve? What you have in a number of democracies is the emergence within one nation or nation state of competing nationalisms, which are really at friction with each other. If you think of India, for example, Indian nationalism of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s was a powerful force which helped launch the modern Indian nation, but it did have a certain idea of national identity related to multiculturalism and secular identity and this and that. But then in the 1980s, a new idea about nationalism in India, Hindu nationalism, began emerging and began conflicting with that. And you now have a struggle over national narratives in India that's actually at the heart of the struggle over democracy in India in some ways. And so competing nationalisms within one nation has become a very important issue in a number of democracies. Turkey is another example, a very nationalistic country in some ways, in the sense of having a fairly clear national identity in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so forth. But then again, emerging in the 1990s, an alternative idea about Turkish nationalism, more based on Islamic identity. And you have, and again, competing narratives of what is the essence of Turkish national identity that, again, lead to problems with democracy because they become conflictive politically and so forth. Israel is another example. Israel, was launched as a nation with a very, a set of ideas about what Israeli nationalism meant. But you have the emergence in the last 20 years of a different, more orthodox and in some ways, religious in new ways, nationalism that is in conflict. So competing nationalisms are also something that's very, very important. And we feel that in the United States as well, when we feel a surge of nationalism in our national discourse. It can be seen as a one-sided affair. There's all this nationalist talk on this side, but the other side also struggles to present or to craft and articulate a nationalist narrative that can stand up to that and say, I'm proud of being an American, but I don't buy your nationalism, which has these characteristics to it. And so within democracies, competing nationalism is very, very important. Now, the thing that I also read the book looking for answers to this question, they raise in the initial chapter of the book the fact that nationalism is kind of on the boil in the world these days. And you name a number of leaders, President Xi, Donald Trump, Modi, Bolsonaro, and some other leaders, you mentioned Theresa May, Brexit, and so forth. And you say that, clearly nationalism is surging in many places, but you don't really come down very hard analytically on why. It reminded me a bit, I wrote a book, co-edited a book 5 years ago on polarization around the world. And it is actually also a kind of demuddling exercise on the concept of polarization, which is subject to similar squishiness as a concept. And I wrote the book and I did not focus very much on why is polarization surging in many places. And when I would present the book, people would just sort of listen to me and then immediately push aside everything, all my fun demuddling stuff and say, why, but why? And they would follow me out of the room, shaking me, why is it increasing? And I'm saying, I'm sorry, I'll write another book. And so I would encourage you to give a bit more thought to that because I think this is a pretty gentle audience, but you may find yourselves besieged by people saying, but why? Why now? So I thought to myself, why? And I guess I'd offer at least an initial answer. You do mention economic nationalism as a force. You do say, well, there's economic nationalism, but I'd be careful not to overemphasize that as a factor. I think if we had not had an administration of Donald Trump and his love of tariffs and the push of kind of deglobalization together with the pandemic and the question of supply chains, which led to a certain moment of the idea of deglobalization, I don't think in many places like Brazilian nationalism has very little to do with economic nationalism on the part of Brazil. And similarly, India is a very globalized country economically, trying to be more so. And I don't think economic nationalism is much about what's going on in India in terms of nationalism. So I don't think economic nationalism gets to the core of it very much. I think what's happening, at least 3 factors that I think are driving the surge of nationalism are the following. The first is the decline in the belief in universal political values, which has occurred in the world in the last 20 years, and the opening up of the sort of post-liberal democracy consensus to a more fragmented world politically gives space to people to put forward sort of proud nationalisms based on political systems that have a very different character. And so, if you, in the 1990s, if you weren't a liberal democracy or trying to be one, you felt a little bit sort of on the side of the world stage. These days, there are leaders out there saying, no, that was a moment. It has passed. There is a new world, which is, fragmented in terms of its political values. And we represent these and you have those, but too bad, that's the way it is. And so the decline in universal values, which I think is significant, is, I think, related to the rise in nationalism. The second is anti-cosmopolitanism, which is not the same as deglobalization or economic nationalism, which is what I really mean is a pushing back against progressive values per se. My colleague Saskia Brechemacher works a lot on gender and politics, and she's doing a project on the backlash against women's rights around the world. Why is there this pushback on all the many gains that were made in women's rights over the last 30 or 40 years? Similarly, in the LGBTQ community, many gains over the last 20 or 30 years in many countries, but clearly a pushback going on in a number of places. And anti-progressivism has become a kind of ideology in a number of places, like Hungary and Russia and elsewhere, that leads to a different narrative of nationalism and a surge of an assertive, kind of grievance-oriented anti-progressive nationalism, because we don't want your agenda. We have our own agenda, and that's a national agenda of ours. And that's also, I think, driving things related to the first factor, the declining of universal values, but a very specific factor. Then the third, of course, is sort of obvious because it's right in our faces, is the relativization of power in the world. When you have a dominant power system with, quote, the West controlling a lot of levers of power in the 1990s, there's not a lot of room for nationalism. It kind of gets suppressed by the power order. But as some autocracies and others have risen, and just the rise of middle powers generally, if you want to be a middle power, that means more space for your nationalism. Turkish nationalism, Indian nationalism, South African nationalism, Indonesian nationalism, et cetera, becomes part of the game. And so the relativization of the power in the world is clearly related to the relativization of national narratives and the tendency for nationalist narratives, I think, to be seized by leaders and to be useful for them. So big things are going on: decline of universal values, anti-cosmopolitanism, relativization of power. Then we begin to feel like, okay, I at least have some sense of why the surge in nationalism seems to be occurring in so many places. I think there are plenty of other factors. These were just some that occurred to me, but I think is worth a bit of thought. And I just close by saying one puzzle that occurred to me, a bit of an analytic puzzle, relates to polarization and nationalism. On its face, you would think that polarization and nationalism are inversely related, because as you talk about fragmentation, if you have a lot of fragmentation, then you have less coherent nationalism because your elite, maybe your society, are fragmented. But actually, what seems to occur is that in countries where you have a high degree of polarization, they become more nationalistic in some ways. The United States is in a phase of greater nationalism in the last 10 or 15 years, at a time when it's very polarized. India has certainly become much more polarized as a political system in the last 10 or 15 years, as it's become more nationalistic. Turkey has become more nationalistic as it has become more polarized. And so what's interesting is that those of us who study polarization and are asked, what's going to help the United States or other highly polarized countries ever overcome polarization? We'll think to ourselves, if only there's a unifying cause where everybody in the country feels part of something and looks past this immediate partisan divisions towards some greater identity. Unfortunately, the contradictory reality is that polarization is actually increasing nationalism, and nationalism is not the solution to polarization. It seems to be an aggravating factor because, to circle back to my first comment, of these competing nationalisms within countries. Instead, what we have is polarization based on clashing national narratives or national identities. So I think that's an interesting sort of analytic puzzle that it's worth focusing on. But once again, congratulations on a fine work, and appreciate the chance to talk today.
Very briefly.
Yeah. I mean, just on this last point, this was fascinating. You made me think with the last point more than any other point, but because and since it's fresh with the audience as well, I was thinking, what's the direction of causality here? Because if the direction is that because of a particular type of competing nationalism rising, you get more polarization, then it's not the direction you were positing. It would be a reverse direction, where because of a particular narrowing definition of what the nation is, narrowing the criteria, in response to that, you may get polarization. Then it could fit in our framework. Of course, we don't address it, but we could co-author something. That's what I'm saying. Meaning it could be a reverse causation here, where actually it's not the polarization leads to more polarization leads to more nationalism, but in fact, particular types of nationalism lead to more polarization because the people who don't like that move to narrow, as Bolsonaro and others did, to narrow or Modi, narrow the definition of the nation, may lead to polarization as a result, as a reaction to that movement by another group of people saying, hey, wait a minute, that's not what it means to be Indian or what it means to be Brazilian. So that could be the direction. Still, it's a correlation, but it's a different direction. Kristine, you wanted on this?
I mean, I think that, yes, the grappling tensions here are really interesting. And I think the question is then what happens next to that notion of that nation, right? So again, because in your definition of nations and nationalism, there are many factors that could contribute to it when there is friction or polarization within a society on one of those factors. And in the US right now, I think the civic values or civic norms are probably that greatest source of polarization, because you do have more linguistic or other elements that are static. If you have, so what happens next with the notion of nationhood in the United States? And and that again is the question of flexibility and evolution and timelines. And so that I think we don't know, but I'm really curious about how that would be addressed.
I have more, but Maya should get, yeah.
I'll also, first of all, just thank you
Yeah.
for really
Glad to
interesting and thought-provoking comments, which is always the joy of, getting to think about further extensions and applications once the book has been written. So there are three things that I wanted to pick up. First, I think Kristine was on your really interesting question of how you think about nationalism change. So thinking about the question of change, I think, is a very, very important question. It is a central political question of our time, and I think a policy imperative in some ways, in some contexts. And I think we really need a lot more empirical research. That's an empirical question. I think we have good ex ante sense of some of the circumstances, war being a very big one. Oksana Shevel at the recent event we were at talked about how in Ukraine, Russian speakers, or how many people identified as Russian within the Ukrainian nation, that had dropped from 22% to 6% in the time before the war started, and the last round of research. And so, that's a massive change in quite a short period of time. And I suspect, big social movements are another modality of change, but I think we need research on that. And
Someone doing a special issue, I thought.
and we are doing a special issue on it, so stay tuned. A second question, or something I wanted to pick up on, was this question of why is nationalism surging? I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I started to write, as you were talking about this question, my answers to that, because I am thinking about this. It was interesting because I wrote down my answers, and then you gave your three. And my sense of it is that kind of 1 and 2 are combined. And here's how I wrote it down. That what is fundamentally at play is that nations, often at founding moments, get defined often by fusing traditional identities of some shape or form to the understanding of what the nation is. And so I think economic nationalism, you're absolutely right, is not the driver of that. It's almost it is exacerbating the displacement of traditional identities as the core of the nation. And that's why, to answer the question you ended on, right, why do you see polarization and nationalism actually kind of as a positive relationship between the two? I think you see that because what has happened in India, despite the fact that, so in India, you're not seeing, the massive displacement of a kind of middle class away from automated, factories that produced cars, and what that has done to displace large parts of the kind of working class and gender identity. I know there are lots of people writing on that, but it's actually also puts out for us the question of what does it mean to be an American? Bart Bonakowski, among others, has shown that there's long been really kind of deep divisions around what it means to be an American, and that has coexisted quite happily in different places in different times. So people have different ideas about that, and those have been stable across time. What I think you're seeing now is that displacement of traditional identity is now rising to political power. And that is also what you have seen in India, as you've seen kind of caste movements. And the emergence of kind of mobilization around caste has really led to a rise of kind of the current Hindu nationalist movement. that idea of India was absolutely there at the moment of founding, but now it's kind of given new force by the displacement of these traditional identities. And then a final point I wanted to make, I think, and this is sort of moving beyond a little bit of the comments, is that how do we think about policy around nationalism? I mean, where do we learn about national narratives? Schools, I think, are perhaps the first and most important place where when you think about what does it mean to be a member of your nation and where you learned about that, probably you learned about it in school. And, it makes me think about how Jill Lepore has been writing in the United States and, these truths about how you tell stories of nations that are shared. And this is at the center of American politics right now in many ways. But one of the things she says in her art and some of the writing is that it's really difficult to tell a shared national story. But the only thing worse than trying to tell a national story and debating that is not telling a national story at all, which leads you to the kind of countries like Yemen and others where there isn't a strong national identity, and that creates other perhaps more serious problems.
Before we open up, can I add? I was also doing the same. I guess training graduate students leads to common results, but I was also trying to answer before you said your three. And I wrote down, first of all, is it on the rise? Like, I think that's an empirical question. I mean, we see it on the rise in particular partisan politics moments in certain countries, but if we looked at the whole world, is nationalism really on the rise? But let's assume it is, and it's definitely in those cases. I wrote down, is it because of demystification of some sort that somehow, which fits with your point about decline in belief of universal? I don't know if you meant the same thing. The second one I was thinking is kind of a backlash to individualism or excessive individualism from a particular type of capitalism that also has to do, I feel, with the fast pace that changes are happening in society, both in terms of values, norms, especially in Western societies. There has been so much change in what is considered appropriate. If you're not paying attention for a year or two, you may actually be out of date with how to behave and modus operandi in different contexts, right? So what are the new norms? What are the new things to follow? And that often may lead people to a type of a reaction or resorting back to more comfortable concepts that go back to the founding or go back to some more concrete things like either religious beliefs or national stories. So it's not orthogonal to what you're saying, I think, but it just adds to the conversation. So I'll shut up so we have more people. Yeah.
Well, you said you wanted a conversation and
Yeah.
getting one,
Yeah.
But let's broaden it now at this point.
Mhm.
Comments, questions? If you could identify yourself.
So I have some sociological questions. One is when you use the title Varieties of Nationalism, and usually that formulation implies a classification system, and I'm wondering whether or not you've classified countries by these varieties. Second of all, I wonder how international migration, which is kind of huge right now, it's not economic globalization, but it is a form of cultural encounter that is new in a lot of these places. And finally, just a more relational question. As nationalism surges in a neighboring country, the boundedness of that country implies that your neighbor is going to also feel more cohesive and turn to defensive nationalism. Those are some questions.
Why don't we take two or three, if that's okay? Cynthia?
I can't wait to read the book. This is wonderful and such interesting comments. I think I'm taking off a little bit of Tom's comments that competing nationalisms can impede democracy. I'm learning a little bit about competing nationalisms and violent conflict. Coming from the Latin American perspective, I think it's sometimes said that it's a region of a great deal of intrastate conflict because of these competing communities. But on the other hand, very little interstate. I mean, there's not a lot of conflict between countries. So is it possible that these competing narratives can impede interstate war because there's not enough sense of the nation as those boundaries to be fighting?
Third one.
Hi, Fran Banton, really fascinating. I have two questions. First is whether, and perhaps this is part of an empirical question, whether there's anything distinct about religious nationalism. I don't think there's any instance about Indian nationalism, British nationalism, various other religious nationalism. And the second is a bit of a squishier question. Colonialism and questions about colonialism and post-colonial legacies are re-emerging as pretty powerful, actually politically grassroots movements and so on, people that haven't necessarily what about those issues? Where does what are the sort of legacies, rethinkings of colonialism, and how do they shape varieties of nationalism and where we might be going?
Why don't we pause there? Just get responses.
You
Author team there,
take-
discuss it if they wish.
Okay. Well, I'll just pick up a few and then
Yeah,
Harris, you
if
can.
there's
Yeah.
anything left,
So I'm going to start with Fran's questions and go backwards. I think, much of the book for me in thinking about it was animated by this question of thinking about post-colonialism, and the part of the world that I study, which is South Asia, very much narratives of nation are shaped by the colonial encounter, and in particular, the ways that the colonial state, in attempt to kind of classify the peoples that they are encountering, we know that casts a very long shadow on the nature of politics to the contemporary moment. Let me just give you one really concrete example. When I wrote my dissertation, I spent some time in the dusty archives looking at the census of British colonial officers that are in South Asia, and they try to understand who is Hindu and who is Muslim. Now, that is a central question of politics in India today. In 1891, there's a census. British colonial officers literally cannot distinguish Hindus from Muslims in many areas of northern India because it's a syncretic religious practice. So they are trying to do this, but they find ways of doing it. And over time, those classification systems matter. And that in particular, I think, is one vector, the way in which colonialism matters. Second, is there anything distinct about religious nationalism? That's actually one of the key questions of my next book project, which is about the relationship between nationalism at founding moments and democracy. So it's speculative at this point, but one answer I'm going to give is that when you, at founding moments, because they, I think, are very powerful, they talk about who can interpret the nation. You take we the people and you fuse it with a religion, and it doesn't much actually matter what religion it is. So in South Asia, you have fused nations that are fused with Islam, with Hinduism increasingly, and with Buddhism. What you do is you take the definition of we the people, which is actually a political question, a boundary question, and you empower religious elites to define who is a good citizen. And those are questions that you essentially punt. So there are two things that happen. So first thing that happens is there are an additional set of actors that become politically activated. And that means politics becomes more difficult and more contentious. And I think a second effect of that is that those questions are never solved. So in Pakistan, a country that I've studied very closely in its politics, who is a good Muslim is, at the founding moment, it was, not the Ahmadiyyas. Then it became, increasingly throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, not the Shias. Now there are sects within Sunnism. This is a never-ending political debate, and so I think it's different from nations that are defined on other kinds of vectors, and I think so that's one thing. Just I'll quickly say about that. on the questions of interest, I'm going to actually, the questions from Cynthia and Hillary came, I'm going to kind of put them, a couple of them together. So this question of competing nationalisms and the encounter through migration, I think there's a shared question there, because I think it's the encounter with difference that often raises the questions of who is the we and how is that defined. So I'm going to go back to actually the question of German nationalism and what we're seeing in the recent elections, the rise of the AfD in the eastern parts of Germany. You know, I would argue that in eastern parts of Germany, there has been less encounter over many decades with what it means to be German in a changing way. Whereas, you know, Western parts have seen more migration, have seen more kind of contestation over what it means to be German. As somebody who myself has German citizenship, you know, growing up as somebody who is half Indian, but people would say, oh, but you're not really German when I was growing up in Germany. I think today that would no longer be said. And I think it shows you how German nationalism, how the understanding of Germanness is changing. And in terms of Elliott's question on classification, it's not something that we've actually gone down the route of. One of Tom's colleagues, Rachel Kleinfeld, read this book from cover to cover and gave us lots of comments. And this is exactly what she said. This is, you know, you need to classify and test. And we said, yes, but the concepts come first, and then we classify and test. So if that's something of interest to you, come talk to us afterwards. It's a project I think that deserves some empirical work, but I think it follows from the conceptual classification.
I'm covered, except to add to Cynthia's question. Usually when I teach political violence, I actually do the opposite of trying to find why civil wars start, from like greed or grievance and all that is going on in that field. I usually tell them, well, most civil wars should be seen as an indication that nation building failed one way or another. Either wasn't tried enough, or it just wasn't good material or a good story or whatever, right? So you can see a lot of the intrastate wars, I think, through that lens. And we kind of implied it here indirectly, but I say it explicitly often. Civil wars, people don't like that because they want to separate the war part and the violence part from that broader discussion of state building and nation building, but they're intertwined. So it goes to the point about schooling. It goes to points about indoctrinating, not necessarily as a negative term always, but we do tell our kids what's good and what's bad. We tell them who they are or who they are not, and so on and so forth. So education plays a huge role about the likelihood you are, how likely you are to get such cases in places where this has happened thoroughly and to everybody in every family. It's less likely you're going to get an intrastate war, but it's still likely you're going to get an interstate war, right? So there are ways that our framework fits 100%, and classification would give us a way if you have a grant in mind that would like to fund our coding project. It would give us a better sense of which countries are more likely to both have internal, at least at the internal level. I think it would say a lot, because as you know, let's say maybe thick types of national narratives that are in places with low elite and popular fragmentation are less likely to get a civil war. Just to give you an example of how we'd combine some of these dimensions to make a hypothesis, like to articulate a hypothesis. Yeah. There's a lot of change.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Nikos, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you if you perceive that there could be a link between emerging sort of forms of nationalism, sort of as a reaction to maybe the diffusal of some cosmopolitan norms to international governance.
So I was going to start by saying
What's
that,
your name?
oh, my name's Anupam Khanna. I used to work at the World Bank. I'm a game theorist turned political economy person, but and now I'm an amateur, whatever. Spend my time seminars and policy. You mentioned that you have treated economic nationalism, but I didn't hear any mention of that. So I was just wondering, what is it that you mean by economic nationalism? Because from there, to me, one word I've not heard at all, and to me, it's the most as politically, from a political scientist perspective, I would have thought a very close relationship, just populism. What is the relationship of nationalism, and especially in terms of its dynamic to populism, which a lot has been written about? In this way, I come up with another question, which I won't tell you how we got involved. It was several discussions over some years. Is it really nationalism now in this present globalized world, a construct by the outsiders for the other? One of the things we talk about populism is it's one way of looking what it means, and is we are talking about defining the other. In the terms of nationalism in the global world, where most of the people who are involved in this thought this was a harking back to the old times. And this perhaps reflects my own thing. All through my life until I came to work, nationalism had a positive connotation. I grew up in India. It was a thing about the nationalists were the people who fought the British, more as unified the nation because the British were dividing and rule. Nationalism was uniting, etc., caste, religion, everything. Here, when I started working at the World Bank, quote unquote, nationalism was a negative connotation. Why? Because in Indonesia, the nationalists were the ones like Habibie who were saying we should be built, who didn't buy into the neoliberal economic consensus. In China, I was involved through the 80s, when we first got involved in China. Quote unquote, the nationalists were the people who were seen as resisting the American intrusion into the decision making. In India, the nationalists were the people who were asking for protection. And so what I'm trying to say, it was really became a definition by the outsiders, anybody who was inconvenient was a nationalist. So it's all sort of stems from how you define economic nationalism.
One last question in this round, go ahead.
My name is Pablo Smith-Siuk. I work on religious nationalism. So first, a very short question to Maya about religious nationalism. You said that it's important how basically religious leaders behave or what leverage they have at the moment of inception. So how much of inception of nationalism? So how this nationalism, like, I don't know, modern nationalism is different from what we see today, which is often very like reactionary nationalism? I don't know, Russia, US, other countries. And a question of maybe more general nature. It struck me what Thomas was saying about relationship between the decline of the universal and the rise of nationalism. And it sounded to me as slightly like counterintuitive. If I think of like French nationalism, American nationalism, it was building on universal values. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, the Bill of Rights. Yesterday, Trump was speaking about Orban. Yes, so like, nationalism is sort of a universal thing. Putin is saying, well, what we want to do is multipolar world where everybody can do whatever they want. Yes, the idea, as you define nationalism, nation state, the desire for certain self-determination, it's also universal. It's in UN Charter. Nationalism as something that has been brought by colonialism, also universal. So to what extent this idea of nationalism and something tribal, isolationist, rather than something that is actually universal, so how do you navigate this dichotomy, and to what extent it is helpful to look from one perspective rather than another?
I can start with the last one. Yeah. So actually, a sociological view, since Hillary is here and she raised it, she's going to make a sociological question. I'm going to give you a sociological answer. Someone like Sinisa Malešević would tell you that actually the rise of nationalism is a result of a gradual process that has been going on for many centuries, that now nationalism is not on the rise, but it's so much more spread around the world. The norms, the understandings, the banality almost of nationalism is everywhere, to the extent that even countries that claim to be legitimating their authority along theocratic or other means, ideologies, let's say Iran or other places like that, are also nationalists. Or China, I mean, famous example would be, communist China is not legitimating its contemporary regime, is not legitimated through communism, in my understanding. It's more legitimated through nationalism. So nationalism is just more omnipresent than it ever was, because it's at the level of the individual. It has kind of trickled down, let's say, to use some concepts from economics. It has literally trickled down at the individual level and has been internalized so much that that's the answer that the sociologists would give. The book is called Grounded Nationalisms. So that's how I don't know how Tom would respond to that, but I want to just tackle the economic nationalism question. I found it really interesting. I think when you were talking about your experience with nationalism, I think what you had in mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that oftentimes people use the term populist in the same way.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm glad because I actually tell my students, some of them are here, that I don't use that term because it has become a slur word for putting it on anyone you don't like as a politician. You say he's a populist or she's a populist, but it's not very useful. Especially you have Bernie Sanders, who has been called a populist by Barack Obama, and Obama on a video saying that populism is great. We should be populist. It means we like the people. And then you have people using it in a complete. So it's kind of like your experience that this empirical duality of the term makes it really not very helpful. That's why we don't talk about populism much, other than actually distinguish it from nationalism in the book. We do spend some time doing that. But
Distinguish between populism.
Yeah, we say that populism, at least in the minimalist definition that is the best one in a way that Kasmuda and others have proposed, is more about separating the nation into a corrupt elite versus the unadulterated kind of pure people. And that, in that sense, it's kind of orthogonal to the nation, right? It's not the same concept. Now, populist leaders who do that, what we just said, or populist leaders, may also be fervent nationalists. Those are analytically distinct, but the fact that they coincide in some cases doesn't mean all populist leaders who have this type of discourse, again, if we buy that definition, are actually nationalists. In fact, we have a lot of left-wing, non-nationalist, kind of progressive nationalists, let's say, who you wouldn't call a nationalist leader, who are populist. So, but Maya is also working on this, so she may have her own view on this.
I think that there are a lot of themes that cut across these questions. So let me just, address the themes. So we're living in a world where it's clearly a world of nation states. And nationalism is the identity that legitimates the use of state power. And because that is so, there is, elites within nation states are competing to define nationalism in ways that boost their relative power internally, right? So I think that's how you relate some of this. But nationalism, I think, also lives in normative world historical time. And that's, again, I think, linked to a number of the other questions. So it picks up on Tom's third point of power relativization, right? We're living in a time where, China is rising in terms of economic power in many parts of the world. So my classroom is very, very international. And there's a lot of skepticism about kind of the US role in the world. And that has its impact on the way that normatively and morally, I think a lot of the values of the US and democracy, the spread of democracy, the way that that's seen. So, I think Pavlos answers the question of reactionary versus religious nationalism, how they're different. I think often they go down to founding moment differences. So it's not so different to my mind. So, to use the case of India, Hindu nationalism was absolutely a narrative about what defined the Indian nation at the founding of the nation. It lost, but now it's being capitalized on again. And so, I think those are very much related. I think, Harris answered the question about populism, but Anupam, who was in the chief economist's office, and when I joined at the World Bank, and when I joined it as my first job out of college, that was the time when I arrived. That was the time of the Asian financial crisis, and I think you're absolutely right that the people who were on the side of protecting domestic markets were called nationalists, often by kind of using the negative normative power of that word to delegitimize people who wanted to protect their internal markets, right? And I think that was very deliberate, and that was another way in which nationalism lives in world historical times. And I think that is changing now. And I think the first question on the emerging forms of nationalism and how that intersects with cosmopolitan norms. One of the best books out there is Yulia Tamir's book on why nationalism. And she, I think, she's a philosopher, she raises the very important question of, are the nationalists right? I mean, one of the ways in which the liberal cosmopolitan elite, they have sort of detached from national norms. They don't pay taxes in any one particular country. They own homes and citizenships based on what is fiscally advantageous. And so maybe nationalism is the way that populists are fighting, the way to fight back against that. And I think there are some very interesting normative questions in that. So I would encourage you to.
Here you go. Thank you. My name is Alexander. I'm from different places in Europe. Grew up in Belgium, which is also an interesting case of nationalism. Practice law in Brazil and mainly focus on Middle East, Israeli Palestinian issues. So I would like to go back to basically Tom's remark about the factors leading to nationalist phenomena across the world. And indeed, since all places that were mentioned here this afternoon have very idiosyncratic features that intervene in all these processes, how would you methodologically conceive any further research in this area? And also, since we spoke about universal values and Western view, how would you avoid the Eurocentric or Western bias in such endeavor?
My name is Al Gombas. I have a list of questions here, but I'm only going to ask two. The first one, well, the reason I'm only going to ask two is because Harris is a patrioti, and that means that we have a thick enough relationship that he will answer my phone calls, so I can ask him the rest of them. And it's a little segue to the first question, which is more on the theoretical side. The other one will be more empirical, but on the theoretical side, on a definitional spectrum, how much overlap is there between the term nationalism and patriotism, as opposed to populism, for example? I can ask what the differences are between the two, but broader than that, how much of them are the same? How much of the definitions overlap? And then the practical one. So back when Harris and I first met in the naught years, I was working in the State Department covering Iraq. And one of the things that we have since lessons learned is that we didn't do a very good job of trying to shore up the idea of nationalism in Iraq. And so when Saddam was removed from the scene, you had to break down to the next highest, or maybe the dominant but suppressed identity for the communities in Iraq, the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurds, and then the religious minorities, the Christians, the Yazidis, the Shabaks, the Kakai, the Sabian Mandians, etc. So my question is not so much about how you formed nationalism or why nationalism forms, but how you can facilitate or foster nationalism in a place where you need it to be, and how do you sort of diffuse it in places where it's too strong or of the wrong kind or something like along those lines. And this may be for everybody in the panel. I don't know how you want to address those, but those are the two questions.
Do you have time for a third? There is one.
Ask a second question or no? Wait.
Well, this would be the last round. So
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
go ahead.
There's another part, it's a theoretical question. To what extent has this anything to do with scale? Because you take, and the easiest way I can think of it is in case of African nationalism, consider Tanzania and Kenya. You talk about Kikuyu nationalism, at least when you talk about Tanzania, it was a very different, you didn't talk about that. Similarly, the other idea of scale is, since everybody has been talking about Russia, Ukraine, and I would say Russia, Ukraine, and Donbass, does it make sense to talk about, and I talk to people outside this country, people talk about that you have to look at, nationalism of the Russian-speaking region, right? That's Donbass, Ukraine, Russia. How does the scale matter?
Why don't we hear final set of responses, and then if there are any final comments from our discussant as well.
So I'll take some of these. Not all of them. So the patriotism question, actually, you made me think of something we don't write in the book. I'll first say, in the book, we basically say patriotism is an older concept than nationalism. That is not disputed. I mean, you can go and check in a way how much older that term is. We first find a definition of patriotism that I've seen in written form in the Iliad, when Hector says, dying for your homeland is the best type of death, basically, and defending your homeland, right? So he says patris, which is where patriotism comes from. He doesn't say homeland. And that's kind of the first, way you can define it, defending a piece of land that you consider your place of origin. That's a very much narrower definition than nationalism, you realize, right? Because nationalism can be expansive. Nationalism can be about, and is about primarily a group of people, not of a particular place, but a group of people. In that sense, you can actually engage in violence and other things in the name of the nation and nationalism, but patriotism is a much more concrete and narrower, let's say, concept. But then while you were asking, that's what we say in the book, but when you were asking this, I started thinking of the way we define nationalism. And then the other thing that is missing in patriotism, very few people would define patriotism as necessarily having something to do with self-rule or some type of, it has to do with territory, but not all these modern ideas of self-determination or necessarily, you could be patriotic and be a subject of an emperor, and without any presumption of equality or membership to the same group. In fact, many emperors explicitly said they have nothing to do with their subjects, right? They're blue-blooded, right? The others have real red blood, right? And all these things that come with dynastic right. So patriotism, though, there were many patriotic people in the Habsburg Empire that knew they had nothing to do with the emperor in terms of national or common affinity of some sort, right? So there are many ways we can distinguish the two, but there is an overlap in modern times, as Maya and I had long conversations about that. We do believe that in modern times, they have become basically interchangeable the way they're used, but that doesn't mean that genealogically or etymologically they're similar, right? So there is that. So you can think of patriotism as a defensive type of nationalism, if that helps you see how the Venn diagram would be. But it's not as simple as that in my response. Turning to your second question, and back then you had invited me kindly to speak to the people who were working under you at State, and a lot of us were saying, there needs to be more of an effort to create a common identity in Afghanistan to begin with, actually, because that was the first, encounter that we had with this. And nation building was not tried. Part of the reason may be because the DoD, the Department of Defense, was made responsible in most of the cases rather than other parts of the US government, for better or for worse. And, I'm not here to judge those decisions, but the Department of Defense did not have anything to do with this type of enterprise. How could the Department of Defense do what we call nation building when they were actually conflating it with completely other terms? And that term became a very different term for 20 years before it was reclaimed by political scientists to mean what you mean now, right? So that's my short answer. I don't want to take too much time to this, but thank you for this. Yeah. Oops, sorry.
These are all great questions. I'll also try to be brief. I think on Alexandra's question of how to avoid the Western bias, I think it's maybe helpful to be clear about what I mean about the Western bias I see in the nationalism literature. A lot of the theorizing on nationalism comes from looking at the European cases empirically, and therefore saying, here are the theories. So, you have a civic nationalism as exemplified, for example, by France, and then the ethnic nationalism as exemplified by Germany. Now, the way to avoid it, I think, is simply to be empirical about the processes by which countries around the world, particularly post-colonial countries, who were imagining the nations at similar points in time in response to a common enemy of the colonial regime, were imagining the nation. So in the case of India, for example, the very early nationalists, it was really interesting. One of the moments that I saw in their memoirs and their writings where they really began to appropriate this concept of nationalism was after the Bolshevik Revolution. So Motilal Nehru, who's the father of the first prime minister, began to write about this in some of his works. And he said, here was a revolution in which the name of the people was taken, but actually used to subvert the power of a powerful monarchy. That's an idea we can use. So that idea is being borrowed and adapted to local contexts. And I think we just need to investigate how that idea is understood rather than assuming the way that it works in Europe is the way it's going to work elsewhere. And so that's what I mean by the Western bias. And I think the way to overcome it is I think that gets Western bias gets thrown around. And so that's what I mean by it and how to overcome it. In terms of the nationalism and patriotism question, I don't have much to add to Harris's except for that empirically, there's very little work that can actually instantiate that these are stably different concepts. I would point you to Marilyn Brewer's work. She looks at American patriotism versus nationalism and the way that gets identified. And she shows a very high correlation between those two. And that under times of threat, one can be primed into the other, which leads me to think it's not really stably different. On the question of how do we shore up nationalism, and we think about it in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think we have to consider that that's not something that American foreign policy can do very effectively in the short term. I think Afghanistan actually shows that to a large degree because the things that are very clearly motivating of nationalism, first and foremost, is a war and a common enemy. And oftentimes, U.S. foreign policy, creates that in the form of the U.S. being the common enemy. I think that's something that Afghanistan politics has certainly has played out in Afghanistan. So I think we have to at least consider that in the short term, the best thing that is to be thinking about what is being taught in schools and investing in schools and common narratives, for next generations. And then finally, on Anupam's question of thinking about scaling Kenya and Tanzania, an economist called Ted Miguel has written actually a very good article about this, looking exactly at those two cases. And one of the things he says is that Kenyatta essentially defaults to Kikuyu, so a more ethnic form of nationalism, and that Nyerere in the form of Tanzania has actually done perhaps the best job of any post-colonial leader in sub-Saharan Africa to articulate a form of nationalism that is not based on ethnicity. And he shows through very careful work that you actually, in multi-ethnic communities in Tanzania, you don't see a decline in public good provision, whereas in Kenya you do. So it's a really nice way of showing how nationalism matters for the present day. And I'll just end by saying there was a recent article that shows that mass squaring during the pandemic was was higher in places where for people who identified more strongly with the nation and where the leaders used the nation in their appeals to the people. So I think, again, we need to think about nationalism as a resource for the state and understand that developing that kind of thickness to the national identity does matter for a state and for a nation.
Here's the question on Ukraine, too. So in the past, the linguistic question in Eastern Europe has been extremely fundamental. And I think what the definitions that Maya and Harris propose is the broader notion of social identity that has a series of factors. And what we're seeing in Ukraine empirically is an evolution, first of all, in linguistic practice. So Russian speakers, or those who did not speak Ukrainian in their home, are shifting to speaking Ukrainian at home. So that's already a very unusual transformation. But in addition to the linguistic piece, there are other factors that are contributing to a notion of a social and national identity. And I think that the changing linguistic behavior is a proxy for the importance of some of those other factors. And the conflict right now, the war, is creating more importance on those other factors that are not just linguistic. And so I think that the plurality of factors that lead to can, but I think in most places often also are, it's hard to find a place where a single factor is the source of national legitimacy. But there is a confluence of factors and they do shift. And so this is, I think, really interesting when you look at Ukraine, and it's important not to oversimplify the importance of linguistic practice, especially in the past, to understand the notion of identity right now, solidarity, and a desire for sovereignty.
All right, then thank you very much for coming. I will just say what I said at the beginning, that I read it, and I hope I read it right. The purpose of the book is not to definitively settle anything, but to ask the right questions and to make it possible to have sort of a dialogue on a concept that is almost sometimes seeming like you're grabbing a bar of soap, and it keeps on slipping away from you, or nobody can grab onto it for very long. And if that was the purpose, then this discussion was proof that you've succeeded and making this kind of conversation possible. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.